much has been happening in the Indian Supreme Court recently, right from the demonetization judgment to the Haldwani and Joshimat issues, which were taken up and not taken up by the Supreme Court, respectively. Then, of course, there's the petition by Jamiat Ulama-e-Hind against the anti-conversion laws of different states. To talk about all this and much more, I have Advocate Aishwarya Mudgil with me. Uh, Welcome to the show,
Namaste,
Aishwarya
Shreya
ji.
ji. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Beginning the conversation, Aishwarya ji, the first thing that we want to know is that, demonetization as a move, it didn't come easy upon any of us. However, all of us as citizens of India, including Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji's mother herself, we all stood behind the Prime Minister and the move, the policy, uh, like rock. And we went ahead with it. All of us went ahead with it. Uh, can you tell us more about the move's legality? And, it was recently challenged in the Supreme Court, and then a judgment also came about. Can you tell us more about that?
So, Shreya ji, first I will give a brief background of what the demonetization process is and what happened in 2016 to sort of refresh the memories of our viewers. You see, currency derives its value from RBI's undertaking, which gives it the legal status, right? Without that, currency does not have a value of its own. So, in simpler words, demonetization means the process of stripping a currency of its status as a legal tender. So, has demonetization happened in India before? Yes, it happened once in 1946 and once in 1978. Now, in 2016, the motive behind demonetization was to stop circulation of black money, promotion of cashless economy, removal of counterfeit notes from the economy. All of this with a move to ensure that there is no terror financing or artificial inflation that may happen in the economy. So, essentially, how demonetization came about was it was effected through series of notifications issued by the central government. The most important one of them being the notification which was issued on 8th November 2016 by the central government in exercise of powers conferred to it under Section 26(2) of the RBI Act, which notified that specific bank notes or SBNs of rupees 500,000 shall cease to be a legal tender with effect from 9th November 2016. Now, what does Section 26, subsection 2 of the RBI Act say? It says that on recommendation by the Central Board of RBI, the central government, by notification in the Gazette of India, can declare that any series of banknotes of any denomination shall cease to have effect as a legal tender. What else did the notification do? It said that the individuals could exchange their specified banknotes by 30th December 2016. It also said that those accounts that were KYC compliant could exchange currency up to a value of rupees 50,000, and those that were not KYC compliant, sorry, the ones that were KYC compliant could exchange up to any value without any limit, and the ones that were not KYC compliant could only exchange up to a value of 50,000. Now, on 30th December, the government passes an ordinance, which was the Specified Bank Notes Cessation of Liabilities Ordinance 2016 by the President of India. After this, the Parliament enacted the Specified Bank Notes Cessation of Liabilities Act 2017. Now, what did this act do? Section 3 of the act said SBNs, that is specified bank notes, which had ceased to be a legal tender due to the 8th November notification, shall cease to be liabilities of the RBI and will cease to be a legal tender or shall cease to have the guarantee of the central government under 26 of the RBI. Section 4 at the same time gave a grace period for depositing old notes in the bank. Government also extended the last date to deposit old bank notes to 31st March 2017. Now the entire exercise was dubbed as draconian, torturous, illegal, unconstitutional amongst others. Now, recently, there were a lot of petitions that were filed even then. Recently, Supreme Court took up the petitions and decided to adjudicate and gave its final hearing only last. So I think I can discuss the remaining issues now.
Yes, absolutely. That what exactly has the Supreme Court held in, about this move, about its legality, and was there any dissenting view, and what was it? Because there's been a lot of talk about that, about the
Yes.
dissenting view in particular.
Yes. So, broadly, the constitutional bench of the Supreme Court had six issues to adjudicate on. Firstly, can the central government under the RBI Act demonetize currency? The main dispute in this regard was whether the central government's power to demonetize banknotes under Section 26 of the RBI Act was limited to demonetization of one or some series of banknotes or all the series of banknotes. So all banknotes have a specific series under which they are issued. So the entire issue revolved around whether it has to be specific series that you can demonetize, or can you demonetize an entire denomination, which happened in this case, right? So the majority answered in this in affirmative by saying that the government has the power to demonetize all series of a particular denomination. The court also said that the move should have a reasonable nexus with the objective that is being sought to be achieved by the demonetization. If government feels that notes of all series of certain denomination are in wide circulation, it can demonetize that particular denomination. Secondly, what the second issue was that whether 26 subsection 2 of RBI Act is liable to get struck down on grounds of excessive delegation or not. To which the majority disagreed with this plea, and they said that it's not like the central government has unfettered powers under 26 subsection 2. Right? Any demonetization exercise will have to be approved by the RBI central board, and to that extent, the government's powers under 26 subsection 2 are not excessive or unfair. And now, just because, and this is one of the more important observations, is just because something can be exploited or misused does not make it inherently illegal. Because by that logic, a lot of the provisions in law will be deemed illegal just because they are liable to be misused. Now, the third contention was that demonetization notification suffered from flaws in the decision making process. To this, the majority relied on exchange and communications that happened between RBI and the central government, and they observed that the entire process and the modalities of the process were discussed in detail between central government and RBI for at least a period of 6 months before the demonetization notification actually came out. So, to that extent, it cannot be contended that there was no intelligent or meaningful discussion between the central government or the central board of RBI. In addition to this, the fact that the 8th November notification was followed by the 30th December ordinance and then by the 2017 Act, it shows that the notification of 8th November was in fact validated. At this point, the court observed that the demonetization process has to be confidential by nature, and hence it has to be taken within a certain specified period of time. So, logically, the court accepted that the legislation could not have come out before the notification. Now, just imagine what the consequences could have been like if the legislation would have been passed, which, by the way, was the case in the previous two demonetization exercises, where the legislation was passed and that's how the demonetization exercise was carried about. So essentially, it's important to note that you can do it by passing a legislation, but the majority held that in the interest of the nature of demonetization exercise, you could or you should not have brought about a legislation. The fourth issue was whether the time that was provided by the central government and the central bank was enough for or the was enough for people to exchange the demonetized notes. So at this point, the court relied on the previous demonetization exercise, which happened in 1978, and that was also challenged. The judgment of which came in 1996, and in 1996, the Supreme Court said that demonetization exercise has to be carried out within a certain period of time, and the longer duration that you provide, that would mean that the number of days in which the circulation of notes would happen, that would be longer. The duration in which the notes would exchange hands would be longer, thereby defeating the demonetization exercise. And it's important to mention that in the 1978 demonetization exercise, Shreya ji, only 3 days were provided for people to exchange notes. Here, in this case, in 2016 to 2017, we were provided a period of 52 days in which you had to exchange the notes. So there was a definite period of time. There were special provisions even made for people who were not in India at that particular time. So as long as you could give an undertaking, you could clarify this entire fact that you were not in India, a special provision was made for you as well. Now, I'm going to conclude this discussion on this point by telling my favorite part, and the fifth and the sixth issue that the court discussed was whether the objectives of demonetization were achieved or not, and whether the government action of demonetization to curb fake currency was in fact excessive or drastic. At this point, the court said that to assess whether a notification is illegal or not, an assessment whether people suffered hardships cannot be the right way. In fact, they made a very important line, which was that every noble cause claims its martyr, right? So we may agree or disagree with that line or thought process, but that was an observation that the majority made. And they said that what instead needs to be seen was whether the objectives of notification had any nexus with the decision. In this case, the majority said that there was a sufficient nexus. So the problem that they recognized with regards to black money, terror financing, etc., had a reasonable nexus with demonetization, and to assess whether an alternative way could have been right or not is not their job, right? So when so that will bring me to the final point, which is about proportionality, where they said that, oh, but this is too drastic, the problem could have been curbed in some other way, or it was demonetization was too drastic, at which the court laid down a test of proportionality. They laid down 4 points, and of which I'll mention the most important and significant point as per me, which is that the court clearly said that the measures to tackle fake currency, terror financing, black money, etc., is the central government's role, and it should be left to the best intelligence of the central government, and such decisions should be outside judicial purview, right? When can courts interfere? The courts can interfere if the discretion has been exercised in an arbitrary and an unreasonable manner, which was certainly not the case here. So that's how the majority ruled. Now I'll come to the minority judgment. So before I go on to discuss the merits of the minority judgment, Shayaji, let me tell you that all the judges were on the same page with regards to one aspect. That is, the entire process of demonetization was undertaken by the central government with the best interests in heart, and with the sole aim of handling multiple issues, including malpractices such as hoarding of black money, counterfeiting, terror funding, drug trafficking, emergence of a parallel economy, inflation, money laundering, amongst others. Having said this, Justice Nagaratna had differed with the majority on the aspect of legality of the process of demonetization. As per Justice Nagaratna, Section 26(2) of the RBI Act gave the power to RBI's central board to demonetize banknotes and not to the central government. What she said was that the power that the central government has to demonetize notes does not come from Section 26(2), but it comes from Union List of List 1, Schedule 7 of the Indian Constitution, right? And to effect that Schedule 7 Union List, which talks about coins and currency, there should have been a legislation that came about pretty much in the same way as 1978 and 1946 demonetization measures, right? And that's where she differed. The second point where she differed was with regards to the reading of section 26(2). And what 26(2) says, and I quote, on recommendation of the central board, the central government may, by notification in the Gazette of India, declare that, with effect from such date as may be specified in the notification, any series of banknotes or any denomination shall cease to be a legal tender. So here, Justice Nagaratna's dissent differed on two aspects. One was whether central government has the authority or not, which, as I previously discussed, she says they don't have the authority under 26(2). The second point where she differed was whether the decision under 26(2) should come from the central government or the central board. In this case, she feels, as per the correspondence between the central government and the central board of the RBI, she feels that the decision should have come from the central board and central government could have implemented it. However, in this case, they did not get a recommendation from central board. Instead, they obtained a consent from central board, right? So in the she differed on the decision flowing, how it should have flown, and she feels that since it they obtained the decision from central board of RBI, that is not the correct reading of 26(2), and hence the notification under 26(2) and the subsequent ordinance and the subsequent act is all illegal. The other aspect that she differed on was whether all notes of the can be demonetized, or whether a certain series of notes can be demonetized. So as I previously said, the majority said that the entire denomination can be demonetized. Justice Ragaratra said that's not possible. You should have, when you say any series, you can only have series of a particular series of a particular denomination demonetized, right? And that was essentially her reading. Then she said that if the bank can demonetize the entire series, right, entire 500 or entire 1000 rupee notes, that would, in her opinion, tantamount to excessive delegation. So on a personal note, I am unable to agree with her view on two broad aspects. Firstly, if the government took the parliament route, as I had previously mentioned, the entire exercise of demonetization would be futile, because you would give people enough time to churn out the excess black money that they have. The idea behind passing a notification was to ensure minimal amount of, to give minimal amount of time so that people do not, have the black money does not change so many hands, right? Secondly, if only a particular series of currency notes are demonetized, the purpose of demonetization again fails, right? You have to demonetize entire currency notes. You cannot say that, okay, 001 to 0010 500 notes are fine, but 0011 to 15 are not fine, and again 16 to 20 are fine. It cannot work that way. If you have too many 500 notes, or if you have too many 1000 notes that you feel are being hoarded, then the entire series should be demonetized. And that's how I am, and the majority also read the term any series in subsection in 2 of section 26 of the RBI Act.
Correct. Aishwarya ji, there's also the point that if any particular series only is being, demonetized, then wouldn't that also result in so much disparity in terms of who would even know where, who has which part of which, which notes of which series?
Correct. I mean, it
Wouldn't
will
that
be
also
very,
result in
exactly. It will
just
be very,
absolute chaos?
exactly. That's exactly what the majority also remarked, that you can't possibly have different series being demonetized, and that will also defeat the purpose. What are you achieving by doing that? So I think that really would have yielded a more cumbersome, chaotic situation, where the bankers would have to constantly see the number of notes or the series of notes that are being demonetized. People would also, I mean, practically think about it, we would be going and checking each of our notes and seeing whether it falls in the series that has been demonetized or not. And you don't know whether what 500 note has gone to terror financing. If you know that a particular series is counterfeit, you can very easily say that this is the series that needs to go, but otherwise you can't.
Correct. So ultimately, it boils down to the rational nexus bit. When you're looking at the constitutionality of any move, it's just about whether there was a rational nexus between the move and, whatever's been finally affected. You know, moving ahead of this, you've just so beautifully taken us through this whole thing and very simply explained the slightly more technical aspects of the whole move. Uh, Taking this conversation forward, I just want to go back to when you were here with us last, and you had talked about the abduction, rape, and forceful conversion of a Hindu minor girl. And where is Hindu minor girls actually in Pakistan? And now such instances are happening in India also. It's not that it's not happening in India. So there is a belief that these are driven by religious motives. And there's also a belief amongst people that such moves, such forceful abductions and forceful conversions are meant to change or are ultimately changing the demography of regions, of specific geographical regions. Do you agree with that?
So I mean, there have been various instances. So let me first make it very clear that in absence of any sort of conclusive research, it would not be fair for me to comment whether or not it's stemming out of religious reasons, or there is a religious sanction to it or a backing to it. But there have been just way too many instances where a similar pattern has been observed, where the girl, as long as the girl marries out of her consent, I don't think it's for any of us to comment on. But what the similar pattern that I'm talking about is where a person hides their identity from the girl before marrying them, and they tell them that they come from the same community. Most of the times it's shown that that the man is coming from a Hindu community, and he tells his name as Ashok, but his name turns out to be something else, maybe from a different community. And I think that sort of a pattern is what is problematic. So I don't think, as I said, there is a I can conclusively say whether there is a religious sanction to it or any sort of backing to it. But there is a definite pattern, and that pattern itself is a little worrisome. And that pattern is what is forcing a lot of these states to get very proactive when it comes to implementing a lot of conversion laws, or interfering in a lot of marriages that happen between people coming from different faiths. And I think that's why the recent gearing up or brouhaha in the media surrounding this entire issue.
What exactly are these anti-conversion laws that have been brought about by several states, including Uttar Pradesh? What exactly do they say? In very simple words, if you can explain it to
Yeah.
us.
So, Shreyaji, first of all, at the outset, as a lawyer, let me make it very clear that the right to freedom of religion is a constitutional right. And to that extent, every citizen has the right to choose the religion they seek to PPP, practice, profess, and preach. But this right does not include the right to convert someone to your religion, right? So, as long as you're preaching, you're telling them that what your religion entails, and they, out of their free will, choose to come into that or embrace that religion, that's a separate thing. But can you convert someone in lieu of money, undue influence? Not so much. And there is a Supreme Court case to that effect, which specifically says that the right to freedom of religion does not include the right to convert someone. Now, let's see who the said anti conversion law seeks to protect. Every bill that is passed is brought about with some thought, some logic, some problem that it seeks to legislate for. There were several instances where women were either lied to about the identity of the partner, as I just mentioned, or the partner's religion, or where they were, lured into conversion in promise of food or educational benefit or any sort of monetary promise. It is in light of these instances that the governments all over the countries were compelled to look into the measures and introduce legislative intervention to ensure that the right to practice and preach does not become the right to proselytize, right? Clearly, the law that has been implemented this has been implemented with the aim not to protect people, maybe well informed people, but to protect the vulnerable groups, especially women or people from certain economic sections who are living in certain hinterlands of the country, right? So this is to benefit and protect people, as I said, especially women coming from certain specified economic and social strata, or maybe even geographical regions where poverty or marriage is used as a means to convert people. While every state has their own legislation with their own modalities, broadly the scheme of every state is the same. It says that religious conversion by force, undue influence, allurement, coercion, fraudulent means, misrepresentation is an offense. Second, who can complain? Any person who's related to blood, any or the aggrieved person or any person related to the aggrieved person by blood can complain. Thirdly, marriage done solely for the purpose of conversion is void. This is already in line with Supreme Court judgments like Lily Thomas or Sarla Mudgal. Fourth, if you want to convert, you as well as the person who's converting you, the pandit or Maulvi or father or whoever is the religious figure who's trying to convert you, will have to make a declaration. And lastly, the burden of proof that the conversion has been done in good faith lies with the person who caused the conversion. So this is the broad scheme of each and every act.
Most of these grounds which you mentioned, like there should not be any representation, there should not be any coercion, they're already part of law of contracts.
Yes.
And most of them seem to have been derived into this law from that you can't misrepresent something to somebody,
Yes.
or you can't exercise undue influence, religious influence, or financial influence on somebody and then try to convert them. There have also been instances like, for instance, recently a video has been doing the rounds on social media from Pakistan, where people like about like a whole bunch of people were converted en masse. So it's a very common phenomenon, and on the face of it, prima facie, from whatever you have shared, it does not look like the law has any unreasonable or arbitrary basis. Of course, it's subject to judicial scrutiny. But what are the grounds that the petitioners have taken to challenge the anti-conversion laws?
So, funnily enough, Shreya, you mentioned about law of contract. This is already something that a lot of opposers of anti-conversion laws, that's the line of thought that they take, saying that contract already is void when, or consent is vitiated when it is obtained by misrepresentation or undue influence or coercion. And that's why they say that anti-conversion laws are not necessary. But unfortunately, what they are missing out is not every conversion or not every marriage is a contract, right? So if you talk about the Muslim marriage, or marriage in Islam, that's a contract. But if you talk about a Hindu marriage, that's a sacrament, right? So you just by saying that, oh, this is already there in contract law and consent gets vitiated, um, that's not enough. We will need something more cogent in place, because as I said, every conversion is not a contract. I mean, coming to the other pleas that people make to justify why anti-conversion laws are not needed, they say firstly that such laws are violative of religion, right to freedom of religion. As I said in the beginning, you have the right to practice, preach, profess, but not to convert. While assessing the constitutionality of a legislation, the court judges whether the legislature has the authority to bring about the law, and if it violates any provision of the constitution. If you talk of Article 25, which is freedom of religion, right to convert is not included. So far, law is very clear that you can practice your religion without making someone else convert freely, forcefully, or by allurement. Right? It is not like the law discriminates against Muslims or Christians. So, as I said, that Islamic marriage may be a contract, but a Hindu marriage is not a contract, and a forceful marriage by, or a forceful conversion even by a Hindu under these anti-conversion laws is also an offense. So I really don't see what the issue is about. It's not like you are discriminating against any religion. All religions are included. Anything that is against, or any place where you've not obtained the consent, that is anyway problematic. So I don't see what the issue is about. The second contention is that such laws are violative of your right to privacy, because you're asking people to declare the religion, right? So if you talk of Article 21 and right to privacy, the law is that as long as there is a genuine need for invasion of privacy, which is reasonable in nature without any arbitrariness, it is justified. There is a need to invade privacy here, and the declaration is reasonable. There is a proper format for declaration also. What is arbitrary here then? Even now, when you give your data for census to the authorities, you declare your religion. You declare your religion, and the court puts up a notice inviting objections, even for marriages solemnized under Special Marriage Act. The 2 month notice, which a lot of people feel is also very excessive, has been brought out with an intent. And what is the intent? The intent is to ensure that any person who is converting either by allurement, forceful marriage, or any sort of kidnapping, the investigative authorities get a 2 month period. They want to see that in that 2 month period, nobody has kidnapped the girl, nobody is duping the girl into believing that the religion of the girl is, of the boy is different than what he is portraying. And as long as there is no selectivity, I don't see what the problem is. As I said, the larger interest, and which also the Supreme Court said in demonetization judgment, we have to see the larger interests of the public. The larger interest of the public, or the larger interest that the government has in mind when it is bringing about something like this, is to ensure that people of certain stratas are not subject to this misery when it comes to forceful conversion, right? And that's what is being protected here. And given that we already declare a lot of data, we give a lot of data to the authorities anyway, I don't see why this is excessive or unreasonable or arbitrary. Thirdly, people fear misuse of law. But the problem is, just because a law is prone to misuse does not mean we don't bring it about, right? I mean, for instance, for 98A, a lot of people complain of its misuse, but does that mean we remove that law? No, it's a beneficial piece of legislation for protection of women. Similarly, anti-conversion laws have to be viewed in the same way. How I currently see it, that the Supreme Court, in the current form of legislation, may stay a few provisions, but if the respective state government suitably amend it, maybe a workaround is possible. Maybe then it can pass the test of constitutionality. I like to give an example. Section 3 of the UP Anti-Conversion Act says that no person shall convert by marriage. Now that is problematic because you are prohibiting everybody who wants to, there might be a person who wants to convert by marriage willfully, right? In that case, you can see how Haryana Act is worded. How Haryana Act is worded is that it says no conversion, no person shall convert by marriage except in cases where you have given a declaration. So maybe UP can also amend its legislation to bring it in line with how Haryana is, and maybe then it can stand the constitutionality test. But well, I'll defer to the wisdom of the court.
And if they're anyway saying that these grounds are anyway covered in the law of contracts, then what is their problem with these anti-conversion laws? Except, of course, the really absolute provisions. For instance, Section 3 that you just quoted.
Yes,
Moving
precisely.
on, a lot of concerns are being voiced across the world. For instance, in Sweden, you can see it in France, you can see it in Canada, that there is a shift or there is a uniform change in the demography of these regions towards increasing Islamism, and this is also happening in India. Do you think that indigenous cultures of such regions, because there is a threat to these to the cultures of these regions. So, do you think that these indigenous cultures need to be protected against such mass cultural takeovers? And if you think they need to be protected, then what do you think are the steps that we can take?
Shreya, to preserve a cultural takeover, I think the first step is to restore the Hindu identity pride in ourselves, or whichever identity people associate with. They need to have pride in themselves. I think we as Hindus, since for sake of discussion, need to teach the younger generation to take pride in our religion, its practices, our festivals. Of course, this needs to be supplemented with strong legislations that prevent cultural takeover of the masses by force, undue influence, or coercion. But as a collective Hindu society, I think there are every legislation, as we are discussing, is subject to judicial scrutiny. But what the society decides will never be subject to a judicial scrutiny, because that's happening from on a different path, in a different channel, right? So as a collective Hindu society, we need to just be more vigilant of how the thought process surrounding our festivals and practices is being cultivated by certain celebrities or certain sections of media, and call them out wherever necessary, right? Derading our faith, or mocking our festivals, or unnecessarily questioning a lot of the Hindu festivals or practices. I think we need to actively call them out, and we need to tell younger generations to be more vigilant. Once they take pride in the practices, once they know why a practice is done in a certain way or why a festival is celebrated, they'll feel closer to their religion and customs. And that will prevent a takeover, because nobody will be able to take them over by force or by coercion. And for everything else, there has to be a law. It is therefore, I feel, the most important thing is to educate the younger generation to ensure self preservation. Rest, even if we bring about a law, that will always be subject to judicial scrutiny.
Correct. Um, but coming back home to India, do you think that this is what has happened in Uttarakhand as well? I mean, in Haldwani. What do you think has happened in Haldwani exactly?
I am looking at it through a slightly. There are two issues in the Haldwani case. So first, I'll give a brief background of what the Haldwani case is about. The residents of this place called Gafur Basti in Haldwani. contend that as per 1907 office memorandum, their ancestors purchased certain plots in this area, which they contend is a Nazul land, which is a government free land, non-agricultural purposes, right? There is also a railway line that's passing through it, the ownership of which was passed in to the railways sometime in 1950s, right, around that area. So the railway contends that this is our property, and to that extent, we are the ones. You are encroaching on our land. Meanwhile, Gafur Basti residents say that, oh, there was an office memorandum, this was passed, and that's why we are the ones who have the ownership for it. In 2016, by the way, the High Court ordered the railways to remove encroachment in that area. So, unlike what a lot of people are being deluded to believe, that one sudden morning in 2022, railways got up and said, hey, just get out of our land, that is not what's happening. This dispute has been in place since 2016, right? In 2017, the state of Uttarakhand sought a review of this decision, which was rejected, and they went ahead. The railways was supposed to go ahead with the entire removal of encroachment exercise. In 2017, again they said, Gafur Basti resident said that, oh, we need to at least hear our side also, and that's when this dispute came about, right? On December 20th last year, Uttarakhand High Court ordered a demolition of structures on that land, holding that there was indeed an encroachment after listening to the plea of Gafur Basti residents. And they said that this land belongs to railways, and to that extent, they have the authority to remove you from that land. Last week, after an urgent listing of this, Supreme Court bench said that there was a human right angle associated with it, and you will have to find a workable solution to rehabilitate the residents of Gafur Basti. And post today, we know that the privilege of finding a workable solution on rehabilitation, or saying that there is a human rights angle involved, does not exist for everyone, certainly not for the residents of Joshimath. Now, there are two problems. One, for the largest time, I was viewing it as an issue of law and order, where a certain side conveniently chooses to not believe that their land, they are encroaching on the property. What is important to note is Supreme Court also never said that they are not encroaching on the property, right? Supreme Court said, oh, we need to find a workable solution because you can't throw out, I don't know, 50,000 odd people in winters, right? So I'm not commenting on the human rights angle, but what needs to be noticed here is what a lot of people are deluded or not mentioning about this entire thing is that Supreme Court also may somewhere like agree with Uttarakhand High Court's reasoning. Everybody knows that there was a land which was encroached on, and nobody wants to sort of take a hard stand. They took a hard stand in
Spell it out.
Joshimath, but they do not want to take a hard stand in Haldwani, which is what makes me very curious. Why this sort of a double standard from the same court? So I think a lot remains to be seen here. As I said, for the larger part, for me, it was a legal battle, a law and order issue. But only after today's difference in reasoning of urgent hearing, whether, where they disallowed urgent hearing by Joshimath residents, but they allowed it for Haldwani residents, is what makes me curious that whether a deeper issue lies, whether there is a sort of differential treatment. I would like to believe that there is none, but it's very hard to convince oneself why the court would take such a different view.
Absolutely, especially considering the fact that with Joshimath residents, it's not like they're on the wrong side of the law
Yes,
at
they
all.
are the victims
They're suffering
for
because
an
of
NTPC project, right?
they're the
Yes, they
victims.
are. They are victims, and here in this case, as I said, the
So
best
they're
part is
the
nobody is
victims.
denying that there was an encroachment. I think on some level, everybody accepts that there is an encroachment, and I think it's just for the Supreme Court to kind of see how do they deal with illegal encroachment. Today it's one person who's illegally encroaching, tomorrow it will be many others, and will you set a precedent like this with everybody? So I think a lot remains to be seen there.
Yeah, and even the wordings of the court were very, very interesting insofar as, the court went on to say that it does not think that it needs to interfere into every issue and that the issue should be dealt with by the by the appropriate authorities. So the appropriate authorities could have dealt with the issue in the case of Halvani as well.
Precisely.
But anyhow, there's a similar kind of bias, or I would say situation was also seen with respect to the Kashmiri Pandits. They also went to, after like 27 or 30 years of their suffering, the actual incidents having taken place, they went to the Supreme Court to ask for an SIT. They were denied the SIT. But in the 1984 Sikh riots cases, the Supreme Court did intervene.
Yeah, I think
So
there is no precedent,
do you
and
think
yeah,
that there is some kind of
why?
something is at play?
It would be very tough and unfair for
Yeah.
me to kind of not have faith in the highest judicial authority of the land. And as a lawyer, I don't think I should do that, because I mean, we are always taught to repose faith in them. So I have faith in authorities. Maybe somewhere down something will happen. And as you mentioned, a very interesting point about Kashmiri Pandits doing this, which somehow reminded me of demonetization. I think a lot of people said that Kashmiri Pandits were forced out of their land in 1989. What can we do today? The same point is with regards to demonetization. What can you do today? You can't unwind the process. And that's something even Justice Nagaratna in her dissent observed, that I can't unwind the process, which makes me wonder that if you can't unwind the process, why was the plea taken up at all? And if you want to adjudicate on something.
And why was the other plea not
Oh,
taken up?
exactly. And why was the other plea not taken up if you can't, do this? And there
And
seems to be an
also the fact that
inconsistency.
the other plea dealt with, yeah,
Other plea dealt with human
and
lives.
also the fact that the other plea dealt with crimes,
Yes,
and a crime never dies. It's the Supreme Court's own
precisely.
words that a crime never
So
dies. Um,
it's a little
anyhow,
inconsistent.
we hope that
Let's
the
hope.
highest court of the land, yeah,
Let's hope.
we hope that the highest court of the land wakes up to
Yes.
these apparent inconsistencies, with due respect, of course. Thank you so much, Aishwarya ji, for joining us and taking us so beautifully through, and very, very simply through so many various topics, which we have come down upon you with. Thank you for joining us.
My most welcome. My pleasure,
Namaste.
Shreyaji. It's always a pleasure connecting with you and the team for discussing issues of legal importance.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.